Hello guys and welcome back to a new video. If you will enjoy it, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments to help me boost this video. Thanks. Today's topic. What's the scariest experience you've ever been through? Story 1. Getting a phone call at work to tell me that my wife's routine surgery had gone wrong due to an anesthetist's mistake, and she was now in a coma in the ICU. I dropped everything and ran. What greeted me when I walked in was the stuff of nightmares. Tubes everywhere, machines beeping. My wife was in ICU for 23 days before they took her off life support, and she died in my arms. Life has never been the same since. Story 2. At about 10 years old, I fell through ice on a pond. When I came back up, I smacked into ice. Instead of the hole I fell through. The water was too murky to see any light from the hole, and I thought that I was witnessing the end of my short life. I was lucky to find the opening again, but as I tried to get back up, the ice kept breaking, and I'd go under again. The whole event probably lasted 30 seconds. But to me, it was a lifetime. It's been 35 years, and I'm still nervous on a frozen body of water. Even if cars and trucks are driving on it. Story 3. One night I was working in a rural old wooden gas station. A masked man kicked the door open and robbed me with a shotgun. He was more scared than I was, which made me more scared than he was. I got him out of there with the money and all the cigarettes. The next day the newspaper published my name and address. Story 4. Watching my 3-year-old son wither away due to leukemia, to the point he was so weak he couldn't walk, sit up, talk, and we would have to hold his head in place so that he could watch Paw Patrol. He's now almost 4 and back to walking again, and seems to be winning this long, hard battle. Story 5. 5 years ago we thought my father had been kidnapped for ransom. Those 3-4 days when we thought he was being held somewhere were absolute and sheer terror. Turns out he was killed on day 1. Story 6. My son's brain surgery. He has epilepsy and had a small portion removed in 2020 to alleviate his seizures and give him a better quality of life. He spent a week with wires in his brain tracking his seizures, as he had them in real time. They slowly stopped his anti-seizure meds to induce them. He had 26 in one night as he slept. Once it was enough data, they removed a portion of his brain near his speech and memory center. This was the location of his misfires. The general consensus was that he had a good chance of losing his speech and memory. His personality could disappear. After his surgery, as he was being taken back to his room, he raised his arm to touch his face. The physician told him not to, and my son said, "I'm not. I just want to touch it." He spoke before he was fully out of anesthesia. 3 days later, he was home. 3 days after that, he was being transported back for emergency surgery because of a nasty infection under his skull. The surgeon later said he was maybe 12 hours from dying if he hadn't been seen. He had no symptoms other than a gross drip. No pain, no fever, nothing. Another brain surgery, and 6 weeks with a drain tube and monitor on him at home with nurse visits weekly. He is now seizure-free and on a much lower dose of meds than he was previously. 15 daily down to 100 milligrams. I spent a month in the children's center helplessly watching my son slip in and out of consciousness and have hundreds of seizures. The possibility of him waking up with no memories and no way to speak was horrifying to me as his father. So the scariest moment in my life, and keep in mind I've been shot, stabbed, and beaten, was almost losing my 16-year-old child 3 times in 1 month. Story 7. About a month ago, my neighbor asked me to go check on her 72F husband 75M, which wasn't super out of the ordinary. I've done it before when she can't get a hold of him. Went in through the garage, called for him, no response. Continued to walk through the house and found him on the floor of the TV room unresponsive, but still breathing, snoring loudly with phlegm coming from nose and mouth. Called 911 for the first time in my life, then had to call my neighbor to give her the news. Paramedics showed up and took him to the hospital before she arrived back at home. He had a brain aneurysm ruptured and passed away a few hours later at the hospital. Harry was a wonderful man that was like a stand-in grandpa for my 3 kids who don't have any family in town. We are so grateful to have known him and the love and snacks he always shared with my babes. Story 8. Back in the early 2000s, I lived in northern Minnesota. I was born and raised in Louisiana, so direct opposite side of the U.S. where the only ice on the roads was when someone dumped out a cooler into the street. At the time I was dating a Canadian girl and went to spend Christmas with her and her family. Drove across the border, went to Ontario, had a good time. I came back across the border a few days after Christmas, sometime late afternoon. It was a 5-ish hour drive from her house to mine. Being the middle of winter, the sun went down very early, so it was dark by the time I got to the first town in Minnesota. I drove down Highway 61, which runs along Lake Superior and is dotted with blink and mist towns. No one travels that highway that late unless they live there or are a trucker usually driving from Duluth to Thunder Bay. The roads were clear, no snow, no ice that I could see, so I cruised along at my usual 60 mph. I hit a curve that had a patch of black ice and sailed off the road. One side of the road was an almost 90-degree drop straight into Lake Superior. The other was into a forest. I sailed into the forest, barrel rolled a few times, and landed on my wheels in a ravine. I credit my seatbelt for saving my life, so I'm now a hard-ass about that when anyone gets into my car. So there were a few problems. First, cell phones weren't nearly as ubiquitous as they are now, and by extension cell towers weren't covering as much area. I had a cheap prepaid cell phone, but no signal. Second, I was in a ravine, so I was hard to see on a road that was hardly traveled anyway. Third, it was the middle of winter, and I think in the single digits, somewhere between 0 and 10 Fahrenheit. I had a blanket I kept in my car in case shit hit the fan like that, but that won't do good for long since I had to stand on side of the road to be seen, and hope no one else skidded on the ice and squashed me. I for certain thought I was going to freeze to death. A local guy named John, who lived in the town of Schroeder, found me. He brought me to the hospital, I think up in Grand Marais, and even let me stay with him for a few days until someone could come get me. He had a long-distance calling card, remember those, that I used to call my roommates and girlfriend to let them know I was alive. I spent the first day sleeping from the painkillers. Nothing broken, but everything hurt. The second day, one of my closest friends said she would come up from Duluth the following day to get me. I slept a lot that day too, and I found out John had this massive collection of musical instruments and played blues. That's what we bonded over, that and him literally saving my life. I found out recently he passed away a few years ago, though I'm not sure where his grave is, but I've been trying to find out just so I can pay my respects. Story 9. Kinda humorous one. A few years ago, in the dead of night, my husband and I were woken up by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering at around 3 a.m. Naturally, we assumed that someone was breaking into our house. Our hearts were in our mouths, but we weren't going to split up, so we went downstairs together to check it out. I have never been so scared as when we had to go through our house, room by room, to make sure there wasn't an intruder. But there wasn't, and none of the windows were broken. We were super confused until we walked into the bathroom. Turns out, tempered glass shower doors have a reputation for randomly exploding. If a crack forms, it very slowly spreads across the rest of the glass, and when it crosses a certain threshold, the whole thing shatters. Ours just happened to be at 3 a.m. I remember years ago my wife and I were in bed, and across the hallway was my probably then 2 or 3-year-old son. It was the middle of the night, and we awoke to a loud thump. My wife and I sat up, and we could hear heavy footsteps coming up our stairs. The stairs opened to kind of a T-shaped hallway with my bedroom on the right, and my boy's room on the left. Thump, thump, thump. My wife and I froze in terror. I had no idea what to do. Do I run out into the hallway and attack? Do I yell? What if they have a weapon? Thump, thump, thump. The footsteps were loud. They were slow but not steady. Unmistakable footsteps. All I could think of was how I had no idea what to do. Someone was in my house, and they separated me from my boy. Our house is a bi-level split, so the stairs coming up are only 7-8 steps. They've walked up almost all of them. The door was open. I stared into the dark hallway and just waited, ready to rush whoever showed up. Thump, thump, thump. I remember wanting to cry. I was so scared for my boy. All of this from the start of me typing had happened over maybe 10 seconds. Thump, thump, thump. There's 8 steps max. Maybe 7. That's too many steps. Thump, thump. Now something was wrong. Thump. I turned on the light and looked around the corner. The hallway was empty. I started turning on every single light. Had my wife stay in the room and get her phone ready. Thump. It was coming from the basement. My heart sank. I was terrified and confused. I called out into the basement. Thump, thump. I went downstairs and looked around. Thump. The sound was coming from our crawl space under the main floor. Thump. It was footsteps. Nothing else could make such an unsteady noise. I knew they were footsteps. For a moment I wondered if someone was on the roof, and the sound was coming down through the house somewhere. Thump, thump, thump. I flicked the lights on in the crawl space. Thump. It's loud. It's metallic. It's my stupid fucking cat that got into the air, ducked, and began to walk around pretending to be John McClane at 2 Fuckingham. The best part is the duct was directly under our stairs, so I was hearing footsteps coming from the stairs. Her fat ass was just bending the duct enough that it would make a thump sound with every step or 2. Story 11. I was in a hospital for months because of something else. Couldn't get up and had already lost a ton of weight, which made me severely underweight. Then caught some kind of virus. The doctors couldn't figure out what it was and got weaker every day. I couldn't eat or drink and vomited all the time. At some point, what I spat out was entirely black, probably dried blood. I can hardly remember that time of my life, but looking in the mirror and seeing my bloodshot eyes where all the veins popped, and my chin and neck with burns from the acidity and stomach fluid in my skinny arms and ribs was horrifying. I think I was around 14 at the time and was sure I'd die. It went on for days and then just stopped. We thought it was that hospital virus that happens sometimes, but apparently it wasn't. Still don't know what happened and how I survived. I was chased through the woods by a stranger with a bat. He seemed hell-bent on beating my brains in. I jumped in a river, held my breath, and sunk to the bottom. I let the current of the river take me as far as I could until I needed another breath of air. When I came up, I couldn't see him anymore, crossed the river, and hid in the woods until it got dark and hiked home. I was on a trail and wound up coming to a house where a little girl was playing in the yard. I waved and kept walking along the trail when she screamed as loud as she could dad. There is someone in the yard. She was probably 150 feet away near her front door. Before I could say anything, this fucking guy smashes open his screen door running full tilt at me while holding the bat. I took off running while he kept screaming, "Come here, motherfucker," over and over again. I lost him while in the woods. I could hear him getting closer, so I jumped through a bush and into the river. Story 13. My mother woke me up in the middle of the night to tell me she had been robbed and stabbed. I had to stay with her while paramedics arrived, helped her clean her wound, and put pressure on it. After she was taken to the hospital, the cops told me it was most likely self-inflicted. I will never forget the feeling I had when she told me, and the sight of it. I will also never forget the feeling of being told my mother was suicidal to the point of stabbing herself. One of the most terrifying, troubling nights of my life. And unfortunately, I have more stories that are wildly similar to that. Story 14. I was 13 years old, and my dad had just picked me up from high school, but had my grandma in the car too, so I sat in the back seat. We were driving back home, and my grandma wanted to quickly run into a shop, so we parked up outside the shop. My gran was having trouble getting up the steps out front of the shop, so my dad jumped out to help her. At that exact moment, I noticed my dad's gold chain he lost a couple of weeks ago under the seat in front of me, so ducked down and reached under to get it. As I'm trying to reach under the seat, someone got in the car. I looked up and they kinda looked like my dad from behind, so I said, "Dad." They turned around and I immediately saw it wasn't my dad. They clearly didn't realize anyone else was in the car and were a little startled, but quickly replied, "Sit back and shut up. I'll let you out in a minute." The key was still in the ignition, and they started the car and peeled off. I have never really felt fear like it. All the worst kinds of thoughts rushed through my head, and I was convinced they had stolen the car because I was in it, but they drove down a couple of streets and pulled over and just said, "Okay, get out." I ran back to the shop and halfway ran straight into the arms of my dad, who had been running after the car. I could literally feel the relief that he was feeling through that hug. Story 15. I survived a chainsaw accident to the throat, the 16th of March 2022. Trachea, thyroid, and epiglottis, hope I spelt those right, were each in 2 parts. The operating doc came by 2 days afterwards with huge eyes and told me about the puzzle pieces he had to put back together. I'm basically fully recovered except for my voice. That sounds a bit hoarse because of nerve damage. It is slowly recovering, and I am going for speech therapy. At the beginning, though, I did sound a bit like Lemmy Kilmister and thought about reviving Motorhead. To start, we are a small, experienced team that do arborism and rope access with all the required qualifications. We had also done a special first aid course that was custom made for our potential requirements. There was no space to park a wood chipper as we were in a residential area, and there the streets are narrow and full of cars. German city. Therefore, I had to cut the branches smaller inside the trailer so that everything fits. I always do my utmost best to stay away from the sides of the trailer. I have done this many times before, but this one time, I remember feeling a punch in my throat, but it wasn't painful. There were a few seconds of confusion. I felt sometimes pulling on my fleece jacket and saw the saw hanging from my jacket. I pulled it off, put the brake on, and switched it off, kind of instinctively. Then it dawned on me that something bad happened. At that moment, my buddy in the tree, who saw it, shouted accident and abseiled. My boss was standing a few meters from the trailer and turned around to me. At that stage, I had already put one hand on my throat to close up the wound. My boss helped me out of the trailer and sat me down on the pavement. My buddy came over to help me sit up while my boss grabbed a compression gauze from the first aid box. Luckily, our van was just right there. While I held the gauze tight, my boss and the 4th guy made the emergency call. At this stage, I realized the extent of trouble I am in and did a quick self-assessment. Do I feel like passing out? No. Can I still breathe, or is blood running into my lungs? No. The strange thing is, at no stage at all did I think that I might not survive this. 6 minutes after the emergency call, every fucking body was there except the press. I just saw a lot of legs from my POV. The first responder doc and her staff were absolutely amazing. The fire brigade stood next to them, and I remember the head honcho looking inside the trailer and immediately giving a correct assessment of what happened. The cops were in the background and closed off the streets. So, transport to emergency room. When I got there, like about 20 people were prepped and waiting for me. The first responder doc brought them all up to date on my condition and stats before the chief specialist took over. He had a lookie at my wound and pressed real hard. That was the first moment I felt a bit of pain. The last thing I remember him saying was propofol. And then I woke up in the ICU shortly before my wife came in. I only spent a week in hospital, and the shittiest part of my day was when the tracheostomy dressing had to be changed. I must honestly say that I am very surprised with myself how I handled the whole thing. After it happened, I was totally calm and collected, and I haven't had any PTSD, although I do keep an eye on myself. My first few days in hospital, I replayed the events over and over, but from my colleagues' point of view, especially my boss. That was frightening. He was the one that could look inside my throat. I think he got affected the most by all this. Anyway, 3 weeks after all this, I was back at work again. It wasn't a problem for me to use a saw again, and a few times I have even done the same job that led to all this, obviously just being much more careful than I already am. I guess it's part of the getting over it process. Story 16. Okay, so this isn't as bad as some others, but here goes. When I was about 7 years old, I got a Furby for Christmas. At the time, I was ecstatic, as I really wanted one. Now, Furbies have their own language, which, one of the words they said sounded suspiciously like my name. My Furby couldn't be turned off save for taking out the batteries, which required a tiny screwdriver that we either didn't have or 7-year-old me couldn't find. Furbies tend to talk whenever they feel like. So I shoved my Furby in my closet, and the batteries started to die. With the diminishing battery life, the Furby started to have a less than friendly sound. One night, at around 3 a.m., I wake up to the demonic sound of my low-battery Furby saying my fucking name. Terrified 7-year-old me evicted Furby the next morning. Story 17. When my dad hit my mom, she called me crying at 1 a.m. saying she'd locked herself in the bedroom. I transferred her half of their savings out immediately and went home the next day to move her out. The rage in his eyes terrified me. I kept a gun on me and didn't sleep at my own apartment until the restraining order came in. I still carry the gun. The divorce is still being finalized. I'm terrified he'll hurt her, and I won't have done enough to protect her. Story 18. My beloved dog, a dock diver and completely amazing swimmer, and practiced athletic retriever, swam off into one of the Great Lakes, the mighty Huron. He had been swimming daily in our more calm inland lakes and was very fit. He made it into the shipping channel, and I was petrified. He was chasing a sailboat, wouldn't come back. No jet ski key in our rental. Little dude swam all the way to Charity Island, in the middle of Lake Huron, about 10 miles. You cannot usually see Charity Island from Point Au Gres, only the lighthouse. It's a fluke he found it in open water. I suspect he chased a pleasure boat there, as it is a tourist designation. I was devastated. Anyway, he was rescued, tired but happy, and brought back to us by good Samaritans via his tags and imprinted collar. He was said to have enjoyed his boat ride and slept like a log. He visited all 5 Great Lakes in his lifetime and never swam off again. He lived to be just 5 weeks shy 17 years old. His ashes were committed to the sandy tides of the mighty Huron, along with my heart. Rip Kirby, my forever pal. I'll see you in the surf once again. Story 19. My wife went past her due date, so her doctor decided to induce the pregnancy. It did not go well. After a dozen hours of no progress, the hospital told us that if we didn't do an emergency C-section, our son would likely die. The whole thing was a blur. I barely remember going to the operating room. My feet were like lead the whole time. Outwardly, I was keeping it together, but inside it was sheer panic. Thankfully, we were at a top-notch hospital, and the C-section went great. However, when we got to the postpartum room, it was pretty clear something was wrong with my son. When babies are born, they kind of look like little old prune men, and not chunky Stay Puft marshmallows. So you can imagine the concern we had when we see his ribcage outlines every time he gasps for breath while pumping his tiny little chest in and out. We alerted the nurse, and she went to the center station to figure out what to do. I overheard her, from inside our room, emphatically telling the doctor on call that he needed to be moved to the NICU ASAP. You know in movies when a character experiences a moment of panic. Time slows down, noise becomes garbled, and they just kind of drift. That happened to me. The nurse pulled me out of the room and explained what was going to happen, and I am just trying to keep it together as I listen. They informed me that because my wife was still recuperating, she would not be able to go up into the NICU yet. So it was just me at like 3 in the morning having to endure them putting needles and IVs into this tiny little life we had made. He ended up being fine, just a little extra fluid in his lungs, and we were out in 4 days, which is nothing compared to many of the parents in a NICU. This was and still is the scariest experience of my life. At a very secluded cabin. Hey, look for fallen tree on left. Now there's a huge boulder. Drive into the bush ... You'll reach small clearing in about 3 minutes. Now veer right at the 3 fallen trees. Kinda place. No electricity, no phone service, no people. Just me and my young daughter. Went into town for more supplies. As we drove through the bush and came into a clearing, there were 2 vehicles and 6 men. No way forward, no way back. They didn't wave or smile. 2 of them talked while watching us. One said something to the other men, and they moved their trucks to let us by. About a month later, I was contacted by police wanting a description of the men we'd seen. A body had been found nearby, and they suspected it was a drug deal gone wrong. Story 21. Warning, creepy stepdad story. Shortly after, my creepy stepdad decided to shove his hand down my pants in the middle of the broad, sober daylight. I let him know in a diary entry that he read that I knew he thought he was seducing me, and, long story short, made it clear that if he thought he could get away with that, he'd better be damned sure he was prepared to get away with murder too. The next 8 months were terrifying because he took it like a rejection and started doing this gaslighting thing where he'd stare at me until I objected and then call me a narcissist for thinking everyone's always paying attention to me. He impersonated me online to my friends to get them to tell him confidential things, and basically I managed the next 8 months with a poker face sitting on a rolling cauldron of anxiety like a lid on a crock pot. And my mom had a dream where Jesus told her to leave him and we got the fuck out. Story 22. Got stabbed in the stomach, like square in the center of my abdomen. I didn't even feel it thanks to all the adrenaline. I ended up in the hospital gripping the bed, while a nurse put a finger into the stab wound in the center of my abdomen. I had been drinking, of course, so I wasn't on any pain medication. But fuck if I didn't sober up quickly. Everything hurts less when I think of that pain. I'll preface this part with the fact I'm a pretty thin dude, so when I lie down my stomach kinda goes inward a bit. So they go to apply the bandages again, and my stomach made like a little bowl for the blood, and they wiped the blood off, and I could hear it splash onto the floor. I remember a nurse said something about needing to get the bleeding under control, in what sounded like a panicked tone. That was the moment I fully realized I might not end up being okay. Ended up having surgery to make sure my intestines were not punctured. They weren't. Was discharged the next day. Had pain walking for about a week, and was back to normal after 2 weeks.